Hello, my name is Alan Ahn, Director of Programs and Communications at the Global America Business Institute, or GABI. Welcome to this nuclear energy podcast hosted by GABI. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Mary Lou Dunzik-Gougar. She's currently president of the American Nuclear Society and also faculty at Idaho State University at their College of Science and Engineering. Mary Lou, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So just to start, Mary Lou, you, as I mentioned, are serving as president of ANS. You're also associate dean of the College of Science and Engineering at Idaho State University, as well as associate professor of nuclear engineering. How do you think your recent professional experience in academia has prepared or helped you in carrying out your duties and responsibilities as ANS president?
Well, thanks for that question. I'm very honored to have been elected to this position, and I've been very fortunate in my career. I've had a variety of experience, and while most of it has been in academia, as you say, I've also had short stints in the DOE National Lab environment and in industry, and I've gained an even broader perspective by living and working in Europe and Africa for several years. In addition, during all of my graduate student and professional years, I've been a very active member of the American Nuclear Society at all levels. So I have a real feel for the nature of the society and its potential. But despite all that experience, I have still learned so much during my time as ANS president. And I'm sure you've heard the saying that, one benefits from a job to the extent that they invest in it. And I've invested significant time and energy during my time as president and vice president with a special focus on a couple of topics that I'm really passionate about. Um, Both of those topics, I would say, fall under the category of how do we decriminalize nuclear power? How do we make it something that is an automatic positive image in people's minds as opposed to so many having an automatic negative image? And two of the things I think are going to get us there and would really help in that eventual decriminalization are one to relook at the whole regulatory basis for nuclear. And by that I mean this: all nuclear based regulations have a very conservative approach to preventing unnecessary dose to people. And I'm not talking just about dose regulation, I'm talking about all nuclear regulation. So, for example, why do we need a nuclear grade pump at a power plant or nuclear grade materials? Why don't we just, like a coal power plant or a gas plant, why don't we just have, an ASME standard type? That the bar that nuclear has to cover is so much higher than any other industry. And it's based on this really conservative linear no threshold policy or hypothesis for dose that, any little bit of dose has a risk. So all of the regulations kind of feed back to that. And I think it's certainly time to revisit that basis. But even before we revisit, what's the theory we're going to use a basis for dose regulations, we have to consider what was the original intention of getting dose to as low as reasonably achievable, ALARA. It seems we have evolved in our industry not to holistically consider optimizing all of the factors and optimizing radiation protection, but we've shifted focus to how do we minimize dose. But is that the right goal? Because we are minimizing dose to fractions of natural background dose, and it's hugely expensive. It just really puts nuclear on a very expensive level compared to other types. So that's one area that I think is so important, and I've worked on. And the other is um, an effort to broaden people's just general understanding of what nuclear is. And I think By the time students leave their grade school or you know, what we call in the U.S. K to 12 education, they have their ideas about things. They sort of know where they're going to go, what they're going to do, if they're going to go to college or not, and it's a little bit too late, I think, to change their minds. So many of us, I mean, we human beings, we develop ideas and values very early ages. And it's only through forcing our brains to think differently like we do when we learn to be scientists and engineers that we change from having emotional reactions to thinking about things, but we still have emotional reactions about other things that we haven't trained our brains to think about. So, what if we could get nuclear just dispersed throughout the K to 12 education system? And then when somebody hears the word nuclear, they don't have an automatic negative impression that they don't really know where it came from, but they have this positive idea of, oh, we had this great experience in my middle school class with Mr. Jones, and we did this project, that kind of thing. So that's where my efforts have really been focused during my time as president.
Well, back in January, a few months ago, Gabby hosted you to present during a workshop on nuclear workforce trends, both in the US and internationally. There's a dearth of talent and skilled workers to support the nuclear industry, not only in the US, but in other countries as well, perhaps due to some of these broader issues that you've just raised. Starting at the university level, how do we encourage the next generation to explore career paths in the nuclear field?
Another great question. And I think about this a lot, given that I am in academia. I think about it too from perspectives outside of my role at a university. In a previous life, before I went to graduate school to study nuclear engineering, I was a high school science teacher. And so I recognize and I value the role that K to 12 teachers play and the impressions that students have from that experience. I also recognize that the workforce aspect needs to be addressed at sort of all levels. So back to my passion for K to 12 education. I think that's fundamentally the first place we have to be. The American Nuclear Society has been actively engaged over the past few years, including myself as one of the active members in this project, developing K to 12 curriculum materials. We call these Navigating Nuclear. And it's very exciting to me. We were approached by a company called Discovery Education, and they're in the business of creating curriculum materials. They're very engaging, very um, easily accessed by teachers and by students. They approached ANS and said, hey, we want to develop curriculum materials for K to 12 in nuclear, but we need your expertise. Well, what they usually do is they'll develop the materials and then they will put them behind a paywall that school districts will, subscribe to. And we said, hey, we really want to do this, but we don't want it behind a paywall. We want this material freely available. So we went out and raised funds for these. We got donations, we got some funding from the Department of Energy, we got private donations, and we are in the final stages now of completing these materials. We have middle school level, high school level, and we're just finishing up elementary level. And so far, we have gotten such positive feedback from the teachers who are using these materials. One of the comments that we received was that about half of this person's class is a group of students who will be, if they finish up, the first high school graduates in their families. And the majority of them were so excited by this material, and they commented that they didn't even think nuclear was real. They thought it was science fiction. So, how do you value just the impact of this entire group of students now just understanding that it's real, it's a possibility? They see real people working in these fields. via the virtual field trips and the career profiles. So I can't I can't say enough how I think the return on our investment will be huge, uh, because we will just be generally changing the general view, the community level view of nuclear. So that's where I really think we have to start. Now, at the university level, we get a lot of students coming into science and engineering fields who, again, really don't know what nuclear is. And so I think at universities, we owe it to ourselves to try to break out of the very siloed system that we have found ourselves in. We have the engineering programs, and then we have the science, and then we have the College of Technology, and it's not because we don't play well with each other. We just don't generally interact with each other. And most universities are structured like that. And so it really is in our best interest to start breaking down those silos so we communicate across these various departments, colleges, programs. And I think that will raise awareness of nuclear. We don't need a whole bunch of nuclear engineers, but we do need people who are interested in nuclear and will take their mechanical engineering training or their electrical training or their technology training to that field. And another level, I think, is better advertising from the industry itself. And I know it's been a struggle over the years. I think most people will agree that in the early days of the nuclear industry, there really wasn't an effort to be open and transparent and communicate well with the public. And I think a lot of that came because the nuclear power industry kind of grew out of the military. And that wasn't, the military aspect was certainly not all about communicating with the public. So that's something that we've been fighting for some years, but that can improve. And right now, with many governments, including the US government, talking about generating power without emitting CO2, whether or not we agree with that emphasis, it, I think, will shed a new and different light on nuclear. Because when you look at the entire life cycle of the types of power production we have, although this is not commonly discussed and not a popular thing to say, turns out that wind and solar, if you look across the lifetime, actually emit more CO2 than nuclear. And nuclear emits very little. And that's just really much in the construction phase. So there are a lot of levels at which I think we can attack this workforce issue. And I'll tell you that communities like Idaho Falls, Idaho, where I live, and that is the home of Idaho National Lab, they will be the host for two new small reactor designs. And they've been working with the city government, the local K 12 schools, local community college, and universities to really gear up and to prepare for a diverse workforce. So I think it's a multi-level problem, and I think we as a human species are pretty darn clever. We're going to create the workforce when there is a need for it.
Well, to your earlier point about early education, I'll just say personally, I had a high school chemistry teacher who was, very objective in his teaching of his depictions of nuclear science technology, and that experience continues to resonate today in my professional responsibilities. Just going back to this January webinar on the nuclear workforce trends, and obviously you suggested a number of potential pathways to ensuring that there is a sufficient workforce in the future for potential needs in the industry. But I guess a particular theme was, how does the workforce adjust or adapt to major changes for the industry on the horizon, specifically the emergence of small modular reactors, non-light water reactor, advanced reactor technologies. There is a diversity of concepts that are being researched, investigated, developed, each with their unique characteristics and advantages. Um, how do we strike a balance between having a range of reactor types available, and then really specializing in manufacturing a more limited set of reactor technologies, and more quickly achieving the economies of mass production that we are going to need?
I think the various efforts we have underway in the US, which are the ones I'm most familiar with, hold great potential. The US Army, for example, I think is taking a very structured and logical approach in their Pele microreactor project. They've got competing designs, they're funding competing designs that progress through stages. And at each stage, the designs are evaluated, and then they are or are not allowed to go on to the next phase if they're making appropriate progress. I think that will lead to a final choice and deployment of the microreactor. Now, the microreactor, of course, is under development by the Army. They've got ideas like, remote deployment when they have to send troops out to an area that doesn't have the infrastructure needed. Right now, they have to transfer diesel engines and huge quantities of diesel fuel, which is terribly impractical and limiting. So, what if they could just put the microreactor components in a few cargo containers and take them in their big helicopters? What a difference that would make, both to deployment and also to remove the deployment when it's no longer needed. Also, for powering remote bases that are more permanent, and even for responding to emergencies, such as when Puerto Rico um, had such devastating damage from tropical storms. What if we could helicopter in a microreactor to restore power more quickly? The DOE has also funded a number of designs in the last year, and the hope is that the DOE will resist the urge that I've seen implemented over the years to continue spreading the funding to all designs, just kind of spread it out and give a little bit to everybody. And hopefully they'll be able to winnow down the designs to just a few that show the most promise. The economies of scale aspect of production, which is certainly one of the major goals of these smaller reactors, it's going to take some time, but it will certainly be helped along when there's a fully demonstrated new reactor and a market is established. Obviously, we need both. We need something that has been licensed and built and demonstrated as viable, and then establishing the market. I really think that when that happens, um, the market will respond. I'm a real believer in demand and supply economics.
Um, One of your main research interests professionally has been radioactive waste management and the disposal and storage of spent nuclear fuel. It continues to be an issue in the U.S. Some advanced reactor types feature fuel cycles that are going to be considerably different from those of conventional large light water reactors. How would such differences affect the broader policy challenge of managing the back end nuclear fuel cycle within the US?
High level waste and spent nuclear fuel disposal or management policy in the US is broken, and it has been for some time. I don't think you'll find anybody to say anything different. But the irony is that there has been no urgency to change the policy. Right now, the used fuel is well and safely stored by the nuclear industry. And for that reason, politicians are loath to tackle necessary legislative changes because it's really not a popular topic with voters. The nuclear waste fund that the government has been collecting from nuclear power owners and operators for many years has a balance on the order of 45 billion with a B dollars, and it earns 1.5 billion dollars every year in interest. So the money is there to pursue the design and siting and construction and operation of a repository, but again, there's no urgent need. I think two actions would make a significant difference in managing the fuel cycle back end for both the current and new reactor designs. And that first, I think, would be to complete the review, the NRC review of the Yucca Mountain license application. It's been partly completed, but it has not been fully funded, and so the review is stopped. But whether or not we end up having a repository at Yucca Mountain, there will be a great deal learned and a great value in having the review complete. And the second thing I think would really make a difference is back to that policy aspect. Changing the legislation that currently gives the government the responsibility for spent nuclear fuel and high level waste management so that a private entity could access those funds and complete what the DOE hasn't been able to do. Now, regarding new designs, the NRC licensing process does include a review of the fuel cycle back end, unlike the reviews that took place for our current reactor fleet. So, as reactors progress toward licensing and deployment, the nature of their waste and the waste forms are being considered. Ultimately, though, until we have a repository design finalized, we won't be able to define what are called the waste acceptance criteria for those wastes. So that will have to come. I think I'll end the answer there.
Um, there's strong cases to be made that nuclear will need to be deployed internationally, whether it's to support global development, uh, environmental objectives such as carbon mitigation, achieving economies of numbers, as we discussed earlier. So there's an increased focus on how reactors, especially advanced reactors, are going to be deployed in developing economies where projections for energy demand or growth are going to be highest. Where can advanced reactor developers and companies do now to design their reactors and attendant fuel cycles to better address concerns regarding nuclear security and nonproliferation? Considering that at some point there's likely going to be a need to export markets for these technologies.
New reactors are being designed very holistically, much different than our current reactor fleet. And by holistically, I mean it's considering um, basically the entire fuel cycle and the operational aspects, considering proliferation, security, and so on. Our current reactor fleet had to add security and proliferation onto the designs. So post construction, post design, and that came in the form of fences and guns and guards, as we well know. But new reactors were incorporating safety and security in the design stage, way before licensing or construction occurs. And some designs even incorporate aspects such as a lifetime core that never needs refueling. So that eliminates any access to the fuel that might be diverted for non energy purposes. So I do think that the security and proliferation aspects are an integral component of the new designs, and that without those aspects, they won't be deployed.
uh, an additional hurdle for some of these advanced reactors in development is the testing of fuels and materials for use in these concepts. Yet there's a scarcity of testing facilities within the U.S. What can be done to expand testing capabilities so that there is sufficient capacity to develop advanced fuels and materials for the next generation of reactor types?
In material testing, fuels and material testing is very important, as you've said. It's a field that I've been working in for some years, and I recognize that neutrons are a rare commodity, right? Getting your materials exposed to an environment that is representative of what they will experience in a reactor is a challenge, and it can be really costly and time consuming. So there's a definite need. But right now, we are, I would say, meeting that need. among the various research reactors in the US and overseas. There are facilities such as the reactor at Missouri University of Research, Science and Technology, sorry, and they are open to any user. The major workhorse test reactor in the DOE complex is the Advanced Test Reactor at the Idaho National Lab. And there are plans for its eventual replacement. So that is being considered. But meanwhile, its core internals are replaced on a regular basis to keep it operating effectively. And it really is a workhorse and it's operating well. The transient test reactor, or TREAT, at the Idaho National Lab has been restarted in recent years for meeting these various needs. So there is an awareness of these needs, and we're working to address it. Meanwhile, I think researchers have become necessarily quite creative at using smaller and smaller samples. So we don't need, for example, an entire fuel pellet or a big piece of a structural material. Smaller and smaller samples can be irradiated and then analyzed with post radiation examination using really clever techniques with microscopes and really super small scale testing. So that has effectively increased the capacity over time. So I think we're evolving to address the needs when the need is very urgent, when there's a broader request for those needs. I think we'll be ready to respond to that.
Very interesting points you just raised there. Mary Lou, I think that would be the extent of my questions for today. Just wanted to thank you so much for your time and, again, sharing your perspectives on these very important issues.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.